Today's scripture reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 29, verses 15 to 28. And if you'd like to, you're welcome to follow along in your bulletins. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me for another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife.
Last Sunday, a congregant read the preview box in the bulletin, and just for kicks, she decided to grab her pew Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 29 to see what I was preaching about this coming Sunday. Upon reading the story, she came racing out to me in the narthex where the receiving line was going on, and she said, "You're not going to preach this, are you?" Indeed, this is a story R-rated that seems more appropriate for a bar or for a bowling alley than for church. There's a wonderful UCC scholar by the name of Walter Brueggemann, a Hebrew Bible scholar, and he has a classic one-liner about this story in the Old Testament. He says that this is a Saturday night story that's bound to offend the pious sensibilities of the Sunday morning crowd. Indeed, this story is as humorous as it is scandalous, but I would also add that perhaps, just perhaps, it is deeply meaningful for all of us as well. Walk back with me into the story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. Once upon a time, you'll recall from the Hebrew Bible, Jacob had tricked his brother Esau out of his birthright and out of his blessing. And because he was on the run for his life away from Esau, he arrived in a foreign territory in the land of Laban. And there he decided that he was going to fall in love with the love of his life, Rachel, Laban's youngest daughter. And he made a deal with Laban that if he worked for Laban for 7 years, Rachel could be his wife. And Laban agreed to this. And we're told in a romantic sort of way that the 7 years passed as though they were a day. And finally, yes, the day came where it was time to get married. And in those days, it was customary for Jewish brides to wear a rather dark veil. The marriage ceremony happened, and the very next morning, we are told that Jacob wakes up and he realizes that he has married Leah, Laban's older daughter, and not Rachel. Yikes. But before we all just decide that this is just a bunch of Old Testament nonsense, I wanted to ask folks a question this morning. Have you ever signed up for one thing in life and life threw you an unexpected twist? Have you ever in life signed up for Rachel only for life to throw you a Leah? Have you ever signed up for Rachel? You signed up for health. You had a plan and how it was going to go. And then you walked into the doctor's office, and just like that, the word was mentioned, lump or lesion or MRI, and life threw you a Leah. Or perhaps over the course of your business career, you can remember a time where you had a plan, you signed up for Rachel, life was headed in one direction, and it was a very good direction. And then all of a sudden you heard a word like change or layoffs or new direction. And just like that, life threw you a Leah. Or maybe you had a plan for a child or for a grandchild as to how everything for that person was going to work out. And it was a Rachel plan. It was something that you had in your mind, and that was the way it was supposed to go. And then all of a sudden, you got that phone call. And just like that, life threw you a Leah. You ever signed up for Rachel in life only to receive something very, very different, if not unexpected? You know, just the other day I was in a boutique store and there was a quote on the wall. And the quote simply read, "Life is all about how faithful you are to plan B." And my sense is in this text, if you read forward, that is exactly what Jacob decides to do, to be faithful to Leah, and unexpected blessings begin to come his way. Bible scholars are quick to point out some of the numerology of all of this. And working for 7 years to marry Rachel, part of what was in Jacob's mind is that this was the biblical number of perfection. He had the perfect plan in mind, and the plan was Rachel. But when life threw him a Leah, it's really interesting to note what Jacob did. We're told that after the morning of the wedding, Jacob approaches Laban and says, "Laban, what is going on here?" And Laban said, "Well, it's customary in these parts of the country for the oldest daughter to get married first, so that's why I threw her in. Would have been nice to know in advance." And then we're told that Jacob makes the big decision, yes, to 7 years later, begin to start working for Laban. He will go on to marry Rachel. And the Bible does say that he loved Rachel more than Leah. But Jacob made the big decision to remain faithful to Leah. Decided to give her a home, a place of protection, loved her during that 7-year period. And this is where the story gets absolutely most interesting. And if you have never heard this before, you'll be forewarned. You might fall off your pew. Jacob and Leah would go on to have a few children together. And their fourth child was a boy by the name of Judah. Judah had a child who had a child who had a child who had a child who had a child. And eventually, in the 10th generation of Judah, along came David, the king of Israel. David would unite with Bathsheba, and they had a child who 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 had a child. And you fast forward, and another child appears onto the scene. You know who that is? Jesus. That's right. The lineage of Christ can be traced back to Jacob's faithfulness, not to Rachel, but to plan B, to Leah. Spiritually speaking, you know what that teaches me? That teaches me that sometimes in life when things go planned, I ought to thank God that it went perfectly as I had planned it. But there are going to be other times in life where things don't go as planned. And when I'm willing to remain faithful to Leah, faithful to plan B, Christ in a hidden way may eventually show up in it all. I mean, really and truly, this story offers me an opportunity to reflect on whether or not the choir might have been right just a few moments ago. I mean, what if God's blessings come through raindrops? What if the trials of this life are God's mercies in disguise, veiled? I can recall a time over the course of my ministry career where I met up with Leah. I'll tell you the story. I was just completing my first year of my Master of Divinity program, and I was participating in a program sponsored by the Lilly Endowment that was sending seminary students to churches all over the nation after their first year of study that were large and exciting churches that were doing some new things. And I was so excited because the church that I was heading to was a wonderful UCC church up in Connecticut. And there were various different students participating in this program, and there was one student who was a young woman at the time, and she really wanted to have a mentor who was a senior pastor who was also female. And so she asked the dean if this could be possible, and the dean said, yes, I can make this possible, but the one church I've got is the UCC church in Connecticut. And do you know the dean of the seminary calls me on my cell phone the night before the placements were made, and he says, Mark, I'm not sending you to Connecticut. I'm sending you to the United Methodist Church in San Antonio. Talk about a Leah. And so I accommodated plan B. I remained faithful to Leah. And boy, did God show up at it all. I met a mentor at that church who will preach the installation service later this afternoon. The church shaped me in powerful ways. I began to see at that church where my identity was as a young minister. And in that church, in that sanctuary, married my wife, Emily. Funny how Christ showed up in it all. I mean, what if God's blessings come through raindrops? What if the trials of this life are at times God's mercies in disguise, veiled? Perhaps you could share a Leah story from your own life, a time when something happened that was completely unexpected, and initially it was confounding for you. But then in your faithfulness and in attempting to be faithful to plan B, God appeared to you and maybe even extended you a blessing or two. I'll close this morning with a final reflection. The impetus for my sermon today came from the search committee at this church, who asked if on the morning of my installation, I would share back with the congregation a word about my call to this church. No, this story in the scripture is not in the lectionary. It's been hidden for centuries. But I went here today because my sense was that I am here in part because of my faithfulness to Leah. You see, about 3 years ago, in the winter of 2020, Leah showed up in my life yet again. You know, Leah the pandemic. You all met that Leah. And I will not soon forget March 22nd of 2020, waking up in the morning to an empty sanctuary. I woke up to something that was not my plan. My plan was Rachel, and this opportunity was not even on my radar screen. But I remained faithful to Leah. I attempted to accommodate that thing called the pandemic, and in it all, I began to become a little bit more uprooted, and God opened my life in all of the disruption to the possibility of something that might be new. Yes, this church entered my life in part because I was faithful to Leah. If you came to worship this morning struggling with a Leah in your life, something unexpected, hang in there. Be encouraged. Remain faithful to Leah. For as Jacob and I can both attest, when you remain faithful to plan B, to Leah when she comes your way, God might just surprise you beyond your wildest dreams.